Okay. Great. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. My name's Erik, and I hail from the West Bay, also known as San Francisco. And yeah, this is a talk that I originally gave at the Golden Gate Ruby Conference in San Francisco. John was there and saw it and asked me to give it here in the East Bay. So I'm happy to do that. And I always like to start my talks just by kind of getting a feel for the room, getting a sense of what everyone is sort of, what level you're at and where everyone is. So I'll just ask you to all stand, kind of get the blood flowing a little bit. If you've written a Rails app, stand up. Great. So that is almost everybody, not quite everybody. And now, stay standing if you've written a Rails engine. Great. And so everyone who was standing and sat down, everyone can sit down now. Everyone who was standing originally and then sat down, we tricked you. And this is the trick. So basically, this only applies to Rails 3.1 and greater, but if you've written a Rails 3.1 application, you've actually written a Rails engine. Because the superclass of Rails application is Rails engine, which is to say, what does it mean for something to be a superclass, right? We often say the superclass has an is-a relationship, right? So a Rails application, right? In Ruby, we actually have the is-a question mark, is_a question mark method defined on all objects. And so we can actually ask an object, what are you? Are you some sort of class of object? And it will answer true if that object is of that class or if it inherits from that class, right? So that's sort of what it means to have an is-a relationship. And so Rails application actually has an is-a relationship to Rails engine. A Rails application is a Rails engine. So if you've written a Rails 3.1 application, you've actually written a Rails engine, maybe unknowingly. And Rails applications actually also have a has-many relationship to Rails engines. So in addition to Rails applications being Rails engines, you can actually mount Rails engines in Rails applications. That's sort of the more common traditional use that we think of for Rails engines. There's actually sort of more, which is that you can mount a Rails engine into another Rails engine, right? So you can take an engine, mount it in an engine, and mount that engine that you mounted an engine into a Rails application, which is itself a Rails engine. So this is basically just to say Rails engines all the way down. This actually isn't quite true. Engines, there's a class called railties, but this is a funny graphic. So. And it's essentially true, right? Like Rails basically is fundamentally built on this concept of engines. So it's an important concept, and I think it's actually worth talking a little bit about the history of sort of how we got here, why is Rails architected that way, because I think the history is interesting and it goes back to actually very early versions of Rails. So it starts with this guy, James Adam, and he's the creator of engines, and he actually originally proposed it a long time ago on Halloween in 2005. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the current version of Rails at the time was Rails version 0.14.2. So this is pre 1.0. Certainly predates my involvement in Rails, which wasn't until after 1.0 in 2006. And I think from going around the room earlier, it predates almost everyone else in the rooms using Rails. So basically, for the entire time that we've had Rails, we've had engines as a tool. So why, in 2013, 8 years later, am I giving this talk on something that we should all be experts at by now, right? We've basically had it in our tool belt forever. Why am I sort of giving this talk now? So I want to sort of tell the history of that. And so, again, it was originally introduced on Halloween, October 31st, 2005. A couple weeks later, DHH, David Heinemeier Hansson, the creator of Rails, responded. He saw that this new thing called engines existed, and he actually wrote a blog post about it and put it up on the official Ruby on Rails weblog. That's the URL on the bottom. You can still go visit it. And I'll just read a little excerpt from it. He says, this is, I think, a really interesting, for me at least, like I wasn't using Rails at the time, I wasn't part of the Rails community at the time, but it's sort of like a really interesting bit of history on how DHH thought about Rails, and sort of how he imagined it would play out and how people would use it. Rails is all about making simple things easy, so you need not abstract them. It's about making the creation of logins, access control, content management systems, all of these business logic components so very easy that you will treasure the application-specific solutions of your own rather than long for the one true login system. And so basically what he's dismissing here are things like OmniAuth, which we were discussing earlier, and Devise, right? These login systems that we all share, right? We all use. This is a common login system for the Ruby community, for the Rails community. Dismissing things like Radiant and Refinery, right? CMSs that we all use. DHH's philosophy is that Rails should be so easy that you just build your own CMS, right? Why wouldn't you want to start from scratch? That's how easy Rails should make web application development. And so I think it's interesting that that was sort of the original philosophy, and to see sort of how far we've come from there.
I like the title of his blog post there.
Yeah, I was going to point that out. It's why engines and components are not evil, but distracting. Yeah, so they're not evil. But sort of wasn't part of the original vision. And he continues, this is from the same blog post. What am I saying? That engines should be stopped? Of course not. That's the, I guess, they're not evil part. But he says, Rails will continue to send a signal with what's included in the core that this is a sideshow project. So he basically says this is never going to be included in core. And it satisfies some needs for some people, that's great, but the goal of Rails is to create a world where they are neither needed nor strongly desired. That's an interesting design goal, and I think by that measure, sort of Rails has failed, Rails has succeeded, I think, in many ways because there's things like engines and pluggable modules and these shared open source components that we all use that make it easy, but that was actually not part of the original vision for Rails. So I think that's a sort of interesting historical note. And just one more post, this was actually on the Ruby on Rails mailing list. DHH continues, engines have not received the blessing of the Ruby on Rails core team because it would be madness to include them in Rails, sort of classic, fiery DHH language. It would be madness. It's a mechanism that's far too easily abused for things that it's not actually suitable for. So, actually it wasn't DHH who said that. It was James Adam. So, you have both the creator of Ruby on Rails saying, the exact quote I think was, we'll continue to send a signal with what's included in the core that this is a sideshow project. That's the creator of Rails. And you have the creator of engines saying that it would be madness to include them in core. So how do we get sort of from here, everyone thinks it's crazy, to here, where it's like fundamentally built into Rails, right? This is, now it's 8 years later, but this has been true again since Rails 3.1, which was released in about 1.5 years ago. Question, yes?
I was going to ask you, do you have any insights into what those abuses were expected to be? Or are you going to cover them in talk? Or what was everybody afraid of back then? Besides the fact that it was, Rails was going to be so easy to use.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, again, I wasn't around at the time, and I'm just sort of, I've researched and sort of dug up these historical documents. My answer would probably be Java and J2EE, that the early Rails, early days in Rails was sort of a reaction to struts and J2EE and what was going on in the Java community, and they were really afraid of becoming that. And I think DHH still sort of has almost a rational fear of Rails kind of turning into that thing that sort of inspired him to create it in the first place. Sort of his hatred for Java and J2E. That would be my guess. But yeah, you can go back. I included the URL so you can sort of read those source materials and draw your own conclusions. And these threads on the mailing lists are all archived, and they're very deep, and I've read through many of them, but obviously not all of them. So I'd encourage you to do that if you're interested in the history of it. So I want to talk about a little bit about sort of how we got from there, 2005, to how we got here, where we are now. Where Rails applications, all Rails applications actually are engines. So the next date that I sort of think of as being relevant was May 21st, 2008. And this was actually the day that Ezra Zygmuntovich, who created the MERB project, introduced a feature of MERB called MERB slices. The idea behind MERB slices was that they would be sort of vertical slices of cake, right? MVC cake. So sort of that metaphor is that when you get a slice of cake, you get all the layers, right? You get your models, you get your views, and you get your controllers in each slice. And they would just be not necessarily as big and bloated as an application. They would just be these little pluggable pieces, but they would have all the same components that an application had. And so I thought this was a really cool idea and a really cool feature. The idea that I could just build a little slice of an application and had everything that I would kind of want in a MERB app or a Rails app. Does everyone know what MERB is? There's like so many people who are new to Ruby and Rails who might not, but MERB was a great sort of alternative web framework. And it basically was a reaction to Rails and some of the directions that Rails went in. So Rails was considered to be sort of a very opinionated web framework, and it was sort of DHH's opinions, which not everyone agreed with. So examples of those opinions were the fact that you had to use test unit, you couldn't use RSpec. You had to use active record, you couldn't use data mapper. You had to use prototype, you couldn't use jQuery, right? And to various extents, you could sort of plug in these components. Some of them you actually couldn't, like you actually just couldn't use Rails with data mapper. You had to use active record at the time that MERB was created. Swapping out prototype for jQuery was a bit easier, and swapping in RSpec was a bit easier. But MERB was sort of a reaction to this opinionated framework, and it was more of a choose-your-own-adventure web framework. And I was a big fan of MERB, and I was a big fan of this feature of MERB called MERB slices. It was sort of modeled after engines, right? It's sort of they both sort of had this concept of slices of an application. And so I actually created something for MERB, a slice called MERB admin. That's kind of why I care about this, why I'm giving this talk. This was my sort of introduction to this whole concept of engines or slices. This is actually the first open source project I ever worked on, or at least the first one I ever created and published on GitHub. And I actually presented it initially at a lightning talk at the first Golden Gate Ruby conference in 2009. It looked like this. If anyone's done Django development, this will look very familiar. So what I basically did was I took the CSS and the JavaScript from Django's admin, which is a great admin. It literally looks exactly like this. And I just wrote a Ruby backend that would output the exact same HTML with the same selectors, right? So every row in the table has the same ID or class that the Django admin would output, and that way all the CSS and JavaScript would just work. And there's a lot of sort of sharing of code in the Ruby community and in open source in general. Obviously, sort of like the definition of open source is sharing code. But you actually don't see that much sharing across language communities. So I thought this was sort of a cool example of building something in the Ruby community, but that borrowed CSS and JavaScript from Django and from Python. So yeah, you can sort of tell just from looking at it. But MERB admin is basically just an admin interface that automatically gets generated for your data. So you would just create your models, and then through the wonderful properties of introspection that Ruby has. You could sort of look into those models and figure out what was going on with them, right? So you could figure out things like data types. This is like an edit field, right? So this was like the list view. You could see all of your data, and then you could easily edit it. You wouldn't have to like write SQL queries to update your data. You'd have this nice interface, and if something was a date, it would know it was a date, and it would give you a little date picker, and if it was a number, it would do that, and if it was required or optional or had some constraints, like it has to be 50 characters or fewer in your validations, it would show you that in this admin interface. And it even handled things like associations. So here you can see, I'm a baseball fan, so all the examples are baseball, but this is a belongs to, has many, or no, sorry, this is a has one relationship. So this is a player that has one team, and it could sort of figure out that the best way to represent that would be a pull-down menu, right? So that you can just select one of them. Okay, so yeah, I built this thing, MERB admin, and it was one of the first MERB slices, and it was very popular. It was really taking off in the MERB community. And then, December 23rd, 2008. It's a day that will live in infamy, a day I'll never forget. And it was the day that there was basically an announcement that Rails would be subsuming MERB, that the two web frameworks were going to merge. And in some ways this was great because it meant that Rails got a number of the really good features of MERB. It got modularity, right? So now you live in an age when you can actually use things like data mapper in your Rails applications. You can use RSpec in your Rails applications as a first-class citizen. jQuery is now the default. And a big part of that came from the influence of MERB team members who actually joined the Rails core team as part of this merger. So Rails 3, what you know as Rails 3.0, was basically the culmination of the merger of Rails 2 and MERB 1.0. Made Rails 3. You can read, again, the historical announcement there. It was a big surprise to all of us MERB hackers. And one of the great features that got merged in to Rails from MERB was sort of this concept of slices. They didn't call it slices, they called it engines, and they built on the original work done by James Adam on engines. But that basically became the same concept in Rails. And so I sort of like that about Rails and about the merger. That we sort of, that's the fact that we have this today in Rails is kind of an artifact of the fact that MERB existed and MERB had this feature called slices. And there was a really sort of influential talk given. You can watch the video. The recording, the audio quality is actually really poor, but I'd encourage you to watch it anyway. It's a really important talk given by Yehuda Katz and Carl Lurch called the Russian doll pattern. And it sort of talks about that thing I talked about earlier, that pattern of being able to embed engines within engines and then engines within applications. That's sort of infinitely nested, right? Infinitely deep. This idea of Russian doll applications and building up your application from these small components that sort of plug into each other. So this talk sort of set the stage for getting this idea into Rails. This was after the MERB Rails merger announcement, but before that merger was actually complete, before Rails 3 was released. And once that proposal was sort of out there, there was this great project called the Ruby Summer of Code that happened in 2010. There hasn't been one before or since, although there's some talk about doing it again this year, 2013. And the Ruby Summer of Code was actually a reaction to the Google Summer of Code. The Google Summer of Code the previous year, in 2009, had a bunch of Ruby projects, which were great, but in 2010 they basically shunned Ruby. All the projects were in Python or Java or some other programming languages. There were 0 Ruby projects. And a bunch of Rubyists, including myself, thought that was bullshit. And so basically we sort of did a Kickstarter before there was Kickstarter. We raised $100,000 and decided that we would sponsor 20 students, give them $5,000 each to basically build our own Summer of Code. And it came together very quickly, but it was a great success. And many of the technologies that are in Rails and in Ruby that we use today were actually a result of that summer of code. And so there was one student in particular whose mentors were actually Yehuda, Carl, as well as Jose Valim, Peter Sanaki. And he's the student who actually worked under the mentorship of Carl and Yehuda on implementing mountable engines in Rails that made it into Rails 3. And yeah, just, obviously this was a huge contribution and really followed from that talk that Carl and Yehuda gave earlier about that Russian doll pattern. He basically implemented that pattern over the course of the summer. And a student who was slightly less lucky, because I was his mentor, he didn't get to have Carl and Yehuda and Jose, was Bogdan Gaza. And his sort of proposal for his summer was to take Merb Admin, the project that I had created for Merb, and basically port it over to Rails. And so he did that, and at the end of the summer, it actually didn't look like this. This is a modern screenshot of what Rails admin looks like, and it's all kind of bootstrapped out. He did his own style for it, so it didn't use the Django style sheets anymore, but I don't have any old screenshots of that. But anyway, this is Rails admin, sort of how it looks today. And you can see it's basically the same thing, but it works in Rails. Just another screenshot. So yeah, so Rails 3 was released, and it included this great feature called engines. And so, again, this is not that recent history. Rails 3 has been out for 3 years now, something like that. And again, so it's like, why am I giving this talk? If this feature has been around for 3 years, we should all be experts at it by now. There's a big thing missing. If you look back at the screenshot, you'll notice there's a bunch of assets. There's a bunch of assets that are here, right? There's all these buttons and icons and things like that. And managing those in an engine was a big pain. Basically what you had to do is you had to write a rake task that would copy them in, and then every time you updated the engine, if any of the assets changed, you needed to run that rake task again. And as an engine maintainer, I needed to manually maintain that, so then I needed to clean out all the old icons and assets and images and things like that. It was a real pain. And so Rails 3.1 introduced the asset pipeline. And the asset pipeline, sort of, say what you will about the asset pipeline, but it was great for engines because it meant you didn't have to do that anymore. You didn't have to manually manage your assets, that you would just build your engine and they would automatically get mounted into your application. This is great. And this sort of brings us up to today, or relatively more recently. It's actually not that recent, it's over a year ago. But this was an announcement from Santiago Pastorino, who's on the Rails core team, basically saying that Rails plugins, which were the old way to build sort of pluggable behavior into Rails, are going to be deprecated in Rails 3.2 and will be removed in Rails 4. And so, again, we went from engines being sort of this sideshow, what DHH described as a sideshow, to being basically the only way to build pluggable behavior in a Rails application. So, again, I think I just sort of wanted to take you through the history before really diving into the topic of the talk. The title of the talk is How to Write a Rails Engine, but I think it's sort of worth talking about kind of how we got here and why we got here. So this ends the history portion of the talk. So to create a Rails engine, oh yeah, question, go ahead.
What's the difference between a gem and an engine?
So a gem is a packaging format for Ruby code. You can actually package whatever you want in it, but it's typically used for Ruby code. And so there's many gems that are not necessarily engines, right? There's gems that do things that aren't related to Rails at all. But when you're building an engine, the typical way to package and distribute that is as a gem. And so, does that make sense? That answers it?
Thanks.
Great. Not all gems are engines, but almost all engines are gems. Okay, so how do you create an engine? And It's actually really easy. It basically looks a lot like creating a new Rails app, right? There's a generator. You run it from the command line, and you say Rails plugin new, the name of your engine, and then you pass two options almost always. You're going to want these options, full and mountable. Mountable just means literally it's sort of what it sounds like. Yeah, question?
Don't you think it's strange that they say Rails plugin new, given what language wonks Rubyists tend to be? You think they would say Rails engine new? But.
Yeah, so it's sort of a historical relic. They basically didn't. This is the reason why you need to even pass these options. Like these, as far as I'm concerned, these options should just be default, full and mountable, and I believe they are default in Rails 4. But because this was released, they basically wanted to maintain backwards compatibility with the old plugin generators. And so to do that, they basically kept plugin the same, and they added these options full and mountable. And so mountable means it's mountable, that it's not a standalone engine, it's an engine that you're going to plug into an application. And full basically just means it's an engine, right? It's not the old style plugin, but that you actually want an engine. You can pass those options. So when you run this command, you'll see something that looks like this. And my only point in showing this is just to say that it should look very familiar, right? If you've ever generated a Rails application, so when almost all of you stood up earlier saying you had done that, basically it looks like a Rails application, right? It's the same idea of this vertical slice of MVC cake, model view controller cake, right? So it has an app directory. Inside the app directory is a models directory, a controllers directory, helpers, mailers, views, assets, everything you would expect to have. There's also a config directory that comes with routes. There's a lib directory. So this should, again, like look very much like creating a Rails application. And there's even a script directory with a Rails script in there, as well as a test directory. So yeah, should look very familiar. And so I'm actually going to, most of these are just stubs or empty files, but there's a few things I'm going to point out that are in the lib directory that are worth knowing about. And so the generator creates a file called, in the lib directory called whatever your engine name is, .rb. And the first thing it does is it requires myengine/engine. So there's by default, there's a file just called engine.rb. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It requires that file, and it just defines a module for your engine. So basically, all your custom code for your engine, not the MVC stuff, right? Not apps, not models, views, controllers, but any sort of custom library code. Basically, the things that you would put in a lib directory in your Rails application are going to go in here, and it sort of defines that module for you as a namespace. So that's pretty straightforward. And then, so this file, the first line, it requires my engine, so this is my engine.rb. And so now we're sort of in that namespace, right, in that module that got defined. And it defines a class called engine that inherits from Rails : engine. And that's basically where the magic happens, right? It's defining this engine that's namespaced by whatever name you gave it, and by inheriting from Rails engine, there's a ton of properties. So for example, earlier when I talked about how you get the automatic asset pipeline behavior, which is to say, when a Rails application looks for assets, it first looks for assets in the application, and then if it doesn't find them, instead of throwing a 404, it will look for those assets in all of the engines, right? You get that behavior for free just by inheriting from Rails engine. And then the other thing you see in here is isolate namespace, my engine. So again, it just creates a namespace for your engine, and that's because you passed the -- mountable flag when you created it. If you had skipped that flag, you wouldn't get the isolated namespace, but you almost always want that. And so here's sort of another difference between building an engine and building a Rails application, right? So not everything's the same. Many things look similar, but not everything's the same. So you should all be familiar with gem file, right? This is sort of how you add dependencies to your application. Here, this is the default gem file, and you basically don't want to touch it. It only has two lines. One, first it just defines the source of rubygems.org, and then it says, it calls this gemspec method, which basically says, look at my gem specification. And this sort of gets to the question that was asked earlier. When you're defining dependencies for your engine, you don't want to just define them in your gem file. What you want to do is you actually want to write a gem specification. You want to build up a package and specify the dependencies there. And that way when somebody installs your engine, they'll get all the dependencies via Ruby gems, right? You have to, Bundler in the gem file doesn't do that for you. Bundler is just for installing gems locally. You need to actually build a gem spec to do that. To get that behavior on rubygems.org when you say gem install. And so there's a file called yourengine.gemspec, and that's where, by default, again, it'll just look for, this is sort of the magic of naming things correctly, and that's how Rails does everything, right? So it just says gemspec, and then it knows to look for the file called whatever you called your engine.gemspec. If you want to call it something else, you can specify a name in the gemspec command, but in general, your engine should have the same name as your as the gem that people install. So I'm not going to cover sort of how to write a gem spec. That's outside of the scope of this talk. There's been many other good talks on sort of writing gem specs and packaging gems. Basically, you just want to add dependencies there. So there's a command called add dependency, and you just say add dependency, and say, it basically looks very similar to the bundler format, except instead of saying gem, the name of the gem that you want to specify as a string, comma, a version number, you just say add dependency, and it takes the same two arguments. So again, you have a rake file, so you can define rake tasks for your engine, and those will be mounted into the host application that the engine gets mounted into. Tasks go in lib tasks. So again, very familiar. If you want to define any custom tasks for your engine, you can do that. And they'll be automatically namespaced. You can define generators. So earlier I talked about how you would, in the early days of Rails 3.0, before Rails 3.1, people would have to run a rake task or a generator to generate all their assets. That's one of the features that is built into engines, and you can totally do that. So anything you want to generate, some engines have migrations that come along with them, right? They have database tables, and so you need to generate those as part of the installation process. You can do that via a generator or via a rake task. It's kind of up to you. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Migrations. So I talked a little bit about this earlier. You can have migrations, like copy over migrations via a generator or via a rake task, but for running those migrations, you actually get this command for free. So again, just by virtue of inheriting from Rails : engine in your engine file, you get this behavior for free. You get a namespace my engine install migrations, and it'll basically do the right thing. So if the user if you have new migrations in your engine that weren't there in the previous version, then the user can copy those. Those will be copied over and executed automatically. If the user has already run those migrations, they won't be copied over and run twice. So this is behavior that you just get for free, and you define your migrations just as you would Rails migrations. There's nothing special. So that's sort of the recurring theme. It's like engines, applications are engines. Engines are basically very similar. You might be wondering actually what the difference is between an engine and a Rails application. A Rails application is basically just a bootable engine, right? So it's an engine that knows how to kind of bootstrap itself and boot itself up. But other than that, engines and applications, Rails applications, are very similar objects. Routes, again, should look pretty similar to your config routes file. It's namespaced by your engine name, and you say ::engine routes draw instead of application routes draw. But other than that, it looks the same, and you put your routes in there. And then on the user side, when they're installing your engine, the command they use is mount your engine name : engine at path. And so basically, what you're doing in your routes is defining relative URLs, and then somebody will mount those. So for example, Rails admin will often be mounted at /admin, but I don't hard code that in my application anywhere. It's up to the user to define where they want to mount that, right? And maybe they already have an admin interface and they just want to try out Rails admin. They can mount it at Rails admin. Maybe they want to run multiple admin interfaces. So this is a very nice feature, right? It's, you just define relative routes, and then user defines where that sort of attaches to their application. Testing, again, so same story, right? Testing an engine is very similar to testing a Rails application. You can use all the same tools. The one big difference is that typically what you do is you have a dummy application inside of your test directory. So you basically are you have some host application that is just like a minimal new Rails application. You mount your engine into that application inside your test directory, and then you run your tests against that application. And obviously you don't need to do that for unit tests, but if you want to have integration tests and stuff like that, then you need to be able to test that it's getting mounted correctly, and that it's running in the context of an application correctly. So that's the one thing to really know about testing.
So would you be running your testing in your development site, or would you be running testing when you actually mount it in Rails?
No, so you test it
So
within the engine itself, but within, like inside your test directory, you normally have a subdirectory called something like dummy app.
I know, that was very confusing.
So that's what it's there for. It's
Okay.
basically just so that you can have a host application that's just a minimal Rails application
To plug it in.
to plug it in. And sometimes people will actually have multiple dummy apps. Like sometimes you'll see, app 3.1, app 3.2, if you want to be able to test your application against multiple different versions of Rails. Test your engine against different versions of Rails.
Yeah, and I hope you'll talk about how you actually specify that and set it up, because I tried to get some of that stuff to work once.
I don't have slides on that, but I'm happy to sort of go through with Rails
Cool.
admin, and like if you ask the question in a minute,
Cool.
yeah, I'm happy to go through some of the example code sort of on the fly. Might not be perfect, but I can show how I do it. And then, yeah, that's basically sort of like nearing the end of the presentation. The gory details are actually very well documented in this website. I don't know if you've all seen the Rails guide, but there's one on engines. It's just guides.rubyonrails.org/engines.html. It was authored mostly by Ryan Biggs, who's done a great job of documenting this, and he's also given some good talks on engines. Yeah, I would encourage you to use that as a resource, and it sort of has, I sort of gave you an overview of how all these things work, but if you want actual more specific code examples and more detailed documentation, it's all in there. And so the last point is sort of like, when should I use these things? Like now I know sort of why they exist and what they are and how they work. So like when do I take this tool out of my tool belt? And I have sort of there's kind of like two go-to scenarios when I think about using an engine. So one, sort of the most common one, is when there's a common bit of functionality in one of your applications that you want to use in other applications, right? So you can just sort of slice that out, create an engine, then plug it into your original application, and then plug it into other applications as you choose. So that's kind of the standard use of engines. There's this other use that I've seen that I think also works quite well, which is basically using engines as like templates. So if you are building a bunch of client sites that all have the same base or all have the same starting point, you can actually use an engine as a starting point, create a new Rails app, plug in that engine, and then you'll have all this functionality by default. So you can basically use it as an easy Rails template without having to like moderate the Rails new generator to generate something custom. You can just do it via an engine. So I think that's sort of a nice use case for engines as well. And if I don't know, if you have a specific question of like, does it make sense to use an engine here? I'd be happy to answer that. So yeah, that's it. Happy to answer questions for as long as you guys want. It's 7:45, so we have plenty of time. And if there's a question that you think of later, I'm at SF Erik. SF Erik on pretty much every web service. So I'm that on GitHub. I'm that on Twitter. I'm that on Facebook and LinkedIn. I'm also that on Gmail, so if you want to email me, I'm just sferic@gmail.com. So just write down those 6 letters and you should be able to get a hold of me. Questions?
So it seems like one of the big advantages is for name spacing that you would want to use an engine.
Yeah, that's right.
That's like one of the main things. And what do you think performance-wise, has anyone tried to do any testing of how, using an engine maybe impacts performance versus just having like some gem that you're mixing in? Because the engine definitely makes it easier to manage things because of the name spacing, but I guess that's a dumb question to ask when you're talking about Ruby, right? Because
Yeah. If you
everything's
care about
kind of-
performance,
Yeah.
use Clojure.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. Use JavaScript.
Okay.
Oh, dig. What is, it's a good question. I haven't done those benchmarks myself. I don't know the answer.
I can't help it. I'm damaged. I was a C programmer, so
No,
I
it's
always
good.
think
It's a
of
good,
performance.
it's a good question. Basically, the name spacing is just done with modules. And so, presumably, if you, that's how name spacing works in Ruby, right? You just wrap something in a module, and then it won't conflict with anything else that has the same, unless it has the same module name.
And I guess the cool thing you said, like with the migrations, where if something changes, it manages all that.
Ah, right.
So like there's like all this complexity that you can
Yeah, I think it's
encapsulate in
worth.
it.
I would say it's like well worth the trade-off.
Yeah.
Right? Like the fact that you don't have to worry. Like there are other admin engines. There's Active Admin, which is actually a very nice one, right? And I've used that in the past, and it's fine, right? Like there's nothing wrong with it. So people should be able to. There shouldn't just be able to be one admin engine, and whoever gets the name first wins, right?
Okay, what's interesting is I've experienced problems working with Devise, which is a Rails engine, because of the name spacing and stuff, and integrating it with OAuth, which we were talking about earlier. And I've met other kindred spirits, even in production environments, that say they prefer to use auth logic because they've run into these like weird gotchas when it comes to using Devise. And maybe I just don't know how to use it well enough, but it seems like sometimes when you use that approach, it makes it a little more difficult to work with, maybe.
Did you have an answer to that question? Your hand sort of shot up when you said that.
I had a similar thing where, how does all that get handled? Like, I once tried to put Refinery in an app, and it uses Devise. And then
Right.
my app itself, I wanted to use Devise.
Right.
And maybe Refinery required a certain version of
Right.
Devise, and I wanted to be on the latest. So are there gotchas there?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, there are. So,
anything?
right, so this is sort of this idea of engines can be plugged into engines, which can then be plugged into applications. So Refinery, the CMS, it's an engine, it uses Devise, which is also an engine for authentication. And you, the end user, the application developer, might be building an application that also uses Devise for authentication. So yeah, if Refinery specifies a constraint on Devise, on the version number, then that's going to hold you back. You're not going to be able to use, you're going to be bound by that constraint. And basically the reason why Bundler exists is because before Bundler, this was a nightmare, right? Because you would have 10 different gems that all depended on different versions of, had different constraints of different levels of specificity on Devise, and you have to try 50 versions until you got the right one. And Bundler just figures out the one that will work for you, or if there are 0 that will work for you, it tells you that the one that will work for you is the empty set and raises an error.
Gotcha.
But in general, these projects are pretty well maintained, right? So Devise, a lot of people use it. If it depends, or Refinery rather, a lot of people use it. And if it depends on an old version of Devise, then there's probably somebody in the same position as you who wants to patch it to get it to use the latest version of Devise. And if not, ultimately it's open source, right? And the beauty of open source is that you can fork it and you can submit a pull request to update to the latest version of Devise yourself if that's something you really care about. And if the maintainers don't want to maintain that code, you can just keep maintaining your fork. You can use your fork and just maintain your little fork of Refinery that uses the latest version of Devise. So this is sort of, it's like the double-edged sword of open source. It's like there's a solution to every problem, and you have to implement it. But at least you can, right? You're not bound by. It's not like you have to send a email to Microsoft or Apple and be like, hey, when you get around to it, if you could fix this API, I'd really appreciate it, right? You can just the beauty of GitHub is that you can.
And if you're mortal, the result is the same, right?
Right.
And just to answer your Devise question, there may be, you might not want to use all Devise, right? So Refinery. Refinery is Refinery core, and then there's other components of Refinery. So you can sort of pick and choose which ones even you want of Refinery to include, so
Gotcha.
you can write your own authentication and just hook into the method calls that Refinery expects for the authenticate engine.
I see.
Because it itself is broken into multiple engines too.
Yep.
Excellent point. Other questions?
So I'd love to see you
Yeah.
go through some testing and see how you set it up for the different kinds of tests, because that's where we're a little nuts. Oh, that's a nice,
The big number, right?
yeah, nice
Um,
hash.
Is that, yeah, everyone can see that? That's nice and large, hopefully.
What was that number for?
I was actually trying, during the presentation about SAFE, dollar SAFE, the global SAFE, I was reading something that said, you can basically break it by doing big math, and apparently that's fixed in Ruby. I'm on Ruby 2.0. I'll actually switch to 1.9.3, the latest patch level, but I was just testing it on Ruby 2. Okay, so let's look at project Ruby apps. Let me actually mirror my screen so I don't have to turn my head. Great, okay. Okay, so this is Rails admin. It uses RSpec for specs, and I'm slightly concerned that this won't, so here, I can run like bundle exec rake, and hopefully this will all pass. Good, people are rooting against me in the audience. But it's good to have a supportive crowd.
Nice fast machine.
It is a fast machine.
SSD?
It is an SSD, and it has four physical and 8 virtual cores.
How much RAM?
Only 8. I neglected to opt for. Oops. I neglected to opt for 16.
For those people new to Rails, if you're running rake tasks, having an SSD drive, it's mostly hard drive speed that constrains it, it seems like, except for some stuff at the beginning of the task when it's doing all the setup, and that's CPU intensive.
Yeah, and that's actually gotten better in Ruby 2.0. A lot of the there was a okay, great.
There you go.
So yeah, there's about 500 specs, and they run in under a minute. And I'm using this really nice feature. It's a little bit hard to see because I have the font size so big and the resolution so small. But this actually, it's a feature of RSpec. In my .rspec file, if you just put -- profile, or if you run RSpec with the -- profile flag on the command line, it'll tell you your 10 slowest specs. And so you can kind of go through and optimize those. And so you can see like the 10 slowest examples take 10% of the time. So if I could optimize those, I could make if I could optimize them down to 0, I could make my test suite run 10% faster just by fixing 10 of almost 500 tests. This one alone takes almost a second. And yeah, you can see these are functional tests. So this is, Rails admin has a history functionality built into it. So it actually creates a database table. If you want this, it's optional. You don't need to use it. You can turn it off. But it will create a database table that will check every user who makes a modification to any of your data. It'll just create a timestamp and who did it and what they did, right? So it's like user deleted an object with this type of object with this ID or something like that. It just sort of keeps an audit log so that you know who did what. And so basically this particular test is testing that it works with the very scientific quantity a lot of histories, and it ensures that it gets the latest ones. So that's why that test is slow, because it's testing that it gets the latest ones even when there's a large quantity of them. Okay, so let me actually dive into the code and show you some stuff. So there's a spec directory that looks very similar to what you might expect. There's a spec helper, so this is a pretty standard. It looks probably pretty close to like a Rails spec helper. We support both Active Record and MongoID or Mongoid, and so you can, there's sort of environment variables that control that control which ORM you're using. And then you can see I'm requiring a dummy app config environment, so that's sort of how you boot up the dummy application. And then again, like this is really common, so just require RSpec Rails, probably looks just like your Rails app. We use RSpec. We use Factory Girl for factories instead of fixtures, and database cleaner as well. And then you can see there's this ORM directory that tests all the different ORMs. So in addition to supporting Mongoid, we also support active record and data mapper as well. And so I can sort of show like it's probably helpful if I showed the .travis. Does everyone know about Travis? Does someone not know about? Raise your hand if you don't know about Travis. Okay, great. I actually gave a talk about Travis at Pivotal Labs that I think was recorded, so you can just go watch it. But Travis is a great way of basically testing your Ruby applications. Actually, now it's not just Ruby applications. You can test almost any type of application. And so I'm going to go to Rails admin. And so it's basically just a continuous integration server, but it's free to use for open source projects. And you can test your application in a bunch of different configurations. So every time you continuous integration means every time you push a commit to GitHub or wherever your source code is contained, whatever the sort of master repository is, it'll automatically run the tests in different configurations and let you know.
Like guardrails.
Like guardrails. I'm not actually familiar with guardrails. Tell me about guardrails.
It's a simple little gem that you fire up alongside of it, and every time you change something, it automatically runs the spec for you.
Right, so it does just that, but it does it in a bunch of different configurations.
Right.
So because this is a gem that I want to distribute to the world, I want to test it not just on MRI, but on JRuby. And I want to test it on JRuby with both the Mongoid configuration and the active record configuration. And then I also want to test it on, this is Ruby 1.9, Mongoid and active record, and then Ruby 2.0, I'm testing Mongoid, active record with SQLite, active record with MySQL, and active record with Postgres. And so, again, you saw the test took about a minute to run, and I have 8 different things in my matrix. So I don't want to spend 8 minutes running tests every time I do something. I just want to push my code and make that all work. And the really nice thing about Travis is, I actually mentioned it earlier, so Travis is an open source project. You can contribute to it. It's the front end is written in Ember, so if you're interested in like seeing a large scale Ember application that's open source, this is a great example of one. And what's cool is like when it's building. Actually, let me just do this. I can restart this build. So the JRuby one will actually be slow. Let me do. So you can see now it's yellow because it's running. Let me do the Ruby 2.0 on SQLite because I think that's the fastest. I can actually look at which one's the fastest. So it gives you the runtime. So it actually looks like the MySQL one is the fastest. You can see here it ran in about 3 minutes and 11 seconds. They don't have quite the SSD and CPU capacity that I do on Travis. So as soon as I hit restart or shortly thereafter, does it do it at the bottom? Might take a minute. Oh, you know what? You might not be able to see this in real time because when I do that, it goes into the queue, and if the queue is backed up, you won't see the job start running right away. But anyway, you can sort of take my word for it that you can watch it running in real time as it runs. It's sort of updating. That's why it uses Ember, because it wants to have that kind of real-time feedback without having to reload the page. And you can see everything that's happening here. So it's like running migrations, and that's another reason why it takes slightly longer on Travis. Like on my machine, I'm not starting with a completely clean environment every time. I have the databases set up. But here it actually has to run the migrations. And then here's the spec command, and you can see it running, and it gives the same output here. So, yeah, question.
Speaking of the Ember and the feedback, Rails 4 has streaming now.
That's right.
And are you going to do anything with that, support that with your projects, with Rails admin?
I'm not sure there's any good use. I mean, if you think of one, let me know. I can't imagine what I would use that for. It seems like it's really designed, you know, if you want to build something like a chat server or even like a game server.
I'm thinking of Travis, excuse me.
Oh, for
Yeah,
Travis.
yeah.
Yeah, I think they've sort of already solved that problem with Ember.
Setting
This is like a
the
bunch of different approaches. DHH's style is kind of not to have MVC on the client side
Sure.
as well as on the server side. He likes just doing it on the server side, and so I think Rails streaming is kind of a solution to how to get this sort of behavior on the server side. Oh yeah, okay, so you can see, is this running? No, okay, never mind. I saw this, the duration counter had reset when I hit reset, but I think that's just means that it's queued. Let me just reload the page.
Reload, yeah.
To see. Shouldn't have to, but maybe I do. Do I? Okay. So, okay, great. So apparently you do have to reload. Ember still has some issues to work out. So you can see, like now I'm in the middle of bundling. You can watch the most fascinating thing in the world. You can watch an application bundle. And now bundling is finished, right? This is all done, and now it's running the migrations. So you can see I keep scrolling down to the bottom. Now it has executed the spec command, and very shortly you will start seeing dots appear.
And you like paperclip over carrier wave?
So yeah, Rails admin supports attachments, so you can upload files, and it does it via paperclip. I'm trying to remember the history of why we chose that. I'm not even sure carrier wave was around when we implemented that feature, and I don't think I implemented that. I'm pretty sure somebody just submitted a pull request and it worked. But yeah, I mean basically it's 6 of one, half a dozen. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Do you know if will paginate in Courier, or was it will paginate in the other pagination one? Copy,
No,
whatever the other one, do they conflict still?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Does anyone else know the answer to that? Does will paginate and the other one conflict?
What's the other one?
Pagination?
Yeah. I remember I was looking
M&R?
at Rails admin a while back and they conflicted.
Oh, because we used will paginate and you used the other one.
Oh, you use will paginate.
I don't know what, I don't think
you
we
use
actually
the other
use,
one.
I don't think we depend on a pagination gem.
Oh.
I think we just roll our own pagination.
At one point.
Probably because there was a conflict,
Yeah,
but
right.
yeah, it's possible that
Yeah.
that happened at one point. Okay, so anyway, let me just show the Travis, this is our Travis configuration file. So you can see these are the different, if you want to set up Travis, it's very easy. You just create this .travis.yaml file, stick it in your home directory, and you can specify different versions of Ruby. You can specify environment variables, so I'm specifying different ORMs as well as database adapters. And you can also, it supports things like IRC channel notifications, so whenever the build passes, Travis has a bot that jumps into our IRC channel and lets us know that the build passed, or more importantly, when it fails. And then you can do all this setup stuff, so you can see here I'm running these rake tasks, so I'm saying like prepare CI environment, rake DB create, rake DB migrate. And then you can also specify services, so we depend on MongoDB to run the Mongo test, so you just say services MongoDB, boom, you have MongoDB. Okay, so jumping back into the spec directory, so there's this dummy application. I'll just go into there to prove that it is exactly, looks like a dumb Rails application. If I open up the gem file, it's just like a normal Rails gem file. So we test against Rails 3.2, the latest one, latest sort of stable one, and yeah.
Question. So if you're like developing your engine, and you do, let's say you're working on the CSS and JavaScript for your engine,
Mhm.
do you boot the dummy app, or do you include your engine in like another Rails app, and then you like
Yeah,
start?
so engines, sorry, I should have said this. Engines are bootable. So there's a script, there should be, ooh, hello. There's, by default, you get a script directory. You get a script directory.
So that's what's on Rails server. It's not.
Yeah, so you can actually, you can run your engine as a standalone application and just hit that engine.
So how do you test it against different versions of Rails? Because you
So
were
yeah,
talking
so
about
you can
that.
just have,
in the
right,
dummy.
so, right, so in the spec helper, so there's in this case, this is not an example of that, but there's a single dummy application, and you can see it's being loaded here. So I'm basically just requiring that application's environment file into the spec configuration, and you can see sort of later down. Maybe I'll just walk through the whole spec helper. So there's some devise setup stuff, there's some RSpec configuration, and then, yeah, so this is basically like the custom Rails admin configuration. So I basically do a config reset, and then abstract model. So we have this thing called abstract model, which is basically like the thing that introspects into your models and figures out what is what you're doing, so that it can sort of present that to you. So abstract model is the class that does that. And then again, like we configure it with history, only in the case where the CI ORM is active record. And yeah, there's some other sort of like custom configuration stuff here. We set up a login that we know works on the dummy app. And then after each test, we reset the authentication stuff, and we use database cleaner as well to clean out the database stuff, so we get a fresh start. That's one of the reasons why the tests are not like blazing fast, right? It's doing a bunch of data like IO, right? Like that's why having a fast hard drive makes it faster, because it's writing, mostly writing, but also reading from disk quite a bit. Yeah, and then like again, so this is like your normal Rails spec directory, right? So you can have controller tests in your controller directory. Right. Oh yeah. So these are namespace. So like that's another important point. So it's like controllers, Rails admin. So that's mostly just to maintain parallel structure. But I can just sort of show. So the main controller is kind of like the dashboard is your home page, and so here, if you write controller tests in Rails using RSpec, this stuff should all look pretty familiar. Does this sort of address, was there a more specific question about like how to do testing? I'm happy to like dive in and get as deep as you want to go. It's 8:04, do I have till 8:15, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay,
You mentioned
so,
doing like dummy 3.1, dummy 3.2 and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you
can
would
do
just
that, right?
replicate it. You would just replicate
Yeah, I mean, you
this.
basically just have, I mean, if you wanted to test in both, you could, there's a couple ways you could do it with environment variables, like on Travis, basically, and just drive it that way. You could just have a loop, right? So you could say like 3.1, comma, 3.2 each do, and then like basically run your tests twice that way. I probably wouldn't do it that way, but you could. Question?
So
Yeah.
question about like development gems.
Mm-hmm.
Do you specify those in your gem spec, or do you specify them in the gem file?
It's a good question. So
And then,
here, I can
like
show
here's an
you.
example too. Like let's say I like to use guard,
Yeah.
you know, but I don't necessarily want. You might not want other developers using guard unless they
Yeah.
choose to use guard. So
Yeah.
you wouldn't necessarily put that in your gem spec, right?
Right, so GemSpec has the concept of a development dependency, but I don't use that. I used to use that, and I sort of had a revelation one day, and I was like, I'm never doing that again. So let me show the GemSpec. So this is railsadmin.gemspec, and railsadmin does have a bunch of dependencies. So sort of for better or for worse. So I should say this. It has precisely one development dependency, which is bundler.
Okay.
And so if you install the development dependencies, it will install bundler, and then that will bootstrap up all your other development dependencies or test dependencies from the gem file. But yeah, basically this is a pattern that I use in almost all the development I do now, which is only specify runtime dependencies in the gem spec, and then specify development and test dependencies in the gem file. I'll show why in a minute. It's actually a great example of why. Was that the? Yeah. No. Kaminari is something else. Kaminari is for documentation. Like it translates Markdown into HTML. We use it for documentation. I think
Is there a test?
maybe I'm confusing it with something else, but
I could be confusing it too. I've never used.
Oh, paginated.
Okay. What am I thinking of? What's the Markdown thing that sounds like Kaminari?
Cram down.
Cram down. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. So apparently we do use Kaminari for that. And apparently we did use will paginate at some point and switched. So maybe because will paginate was like not being nice.
It wasn't being maintained for a while, and now it's being maintained again.
Right, and maybe it wasn't. It was like causing conflicts or something.
Well, at one point they conflicted, and I don't remember, was it the Rails admin or the other admin?
Active admin is the other big one, yeah.
We made a fix for it, but I know it was more difficult than the other project, and I haven't followed up on it in like a year and a half or so. I have no idea what the status is.
Right. So like but this definitely like addresses the question earlier. Like we depend on HAML because we like to write our Rails admin views in HAML. And so if you don't want to have HAML bundled into your application, tough. Like you have to choose between that and Rails admin, right? And same thing with like jQuery Rails. Like if jQuery Rails conflicts with whatever JavaScript library you're using, it shouldn't. But if for some reason it does, then you have to choose between that and Rails admin. So like there's more dependencies here, honestly, than I would like, and it's sort of just grown over time. Like we also use Coffee Rails for CoffeeScript. A lot of this stuff is like pretty standard, and
you are using PJAX.
And we are using PJAX. That's right. Yeah, and like recently added YAML because of like the YAML security vulnerabilities. So there's a bunch of dependencies, and that sort of is what it is. But to get to the sort of more, and this is for those asking, this is kind of what a gem spec looks like. Pretty similar to a gem file. This is a gem file, and so you can see like the thing that a gem spec doesn't allow you to do is have like scoping like this. So you can say like only in the scope, like only when you're bundling on JRuby, install these particular. There's like for JRuby there's a custom active record adapter and a custom MySQL and Postgres adapter and SQLite adapter, and so like you just don't have the same type of flexibility, and again you can see it's just sort of driven, it's a case statement that's driven by an environment variable. So it's both, right? It's using a feature of bundler, which is only specifying these dependencies in the context of JRuby, and then this is looking for a particular environment variable to figure which adapter to bundle.
Do that not platform JRuby?
Say that again?
You want, let's say for example, and I don't have a use case for this, but you want platforms JRuby, but also platform not JRuby, as opposed to listing out all the alternatives.
So there's a bunch of platform declarations. So there's one which is Ruby. Ruby is basically means like MRI and Rubinius.
Right.
And then so this is like MRI Rubinius, and then MS Win, which is Ruby and Windows, and then this is for SIGWin.
Would it be nice if you could just say not JRuby?
You can't. There's no you would have to list out all the others, but you could also just put them outside that JRuby block. Right? That's basically the same thing. Like if you don't have a platform block, but you want to specifically not install gems in JRuby?
I don't. I just said
it's a little bit
is
of
it possible. I don't.
It's a little bit of a weird use case, but no, you have to create a long list of all the other platforms. Typically JRuby, it's like a positive delta, right? Like there's extra gems that you need, but installing the other gems won't break anything. But if you do, you can just say like, typically you can just say like platform Ruby or whatever.
So does that segregate Rubinius from MRI?
There's no way to segregate Rubinius from MRI in bundler's platform syntax. You could, a gem file is a Ruby file, it's an interpreted Ruby file, so you could use whatever constants that it gives you to do, like you could just write an if statement in here, but there's no built-in bundler way to do that. Does that answer that? That answers the question. Any other questions about that? Good. We're right about at time, so I think that's good. Thanks for coming, everybody.
All right, thank you. Very nice.